If you love classic cars, then Donald loves you. I'm driving a car today that represents many different things. And some of them relate to probably the most important reason why I'm driving this car today, which is that this is one of the cars from the collection of Dr. Nicholas Begovich, which came into the Audrain collections in 2020. And you should watch the other videos here on the Audrain Museum Network that feature the cars of Dr. Begovich. On the network here, there are videos of me driving his 300 SL Mercedes Gullwing, his Lamborghini Miura, his Corvair Monza Spider Club Coupe, his Bora, Maserati Bora, his Porsche 904. And you'll also see here on YouTube our friend Jay Leno driving the Talbot Lago record that was also a part of this collection. Now, Dr. Begovich had a very, very, very keen eye and deep emotional sense for cars with interesting engineering solutions. He was a brilliant electrical engineer who, it's not inaccurate to say, was largely responsible for most of the guidance systems in the defensive weapons that kept us all safe throughout the 1950s and 60s, when he was a senior VP at Hughes Aircraft and then president at Litton Data Systems. He was particularly drawn to rear and mid-engine solutions, but the car I'm driving today, of course, is neither rear nor mid-engine. It's a front-engine car, but it's a rather special front-engine car. This is a 1964 Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint Speciale. And something that it has in common with another of the cars in the Begovich collection, which you will also see a video of me driving here on the channel, the 1964 ATS 2500 GTS, because they are both designed by the brilliant Franco Scaglione. And this car, the Giulietta, is the road-going heir to the great Alfa Romeo Berlina Aerodinamica Tecnica cars of the 1950s, also of course designed by Franco Scaglione. In the BAT cars, Franco Scaglione, working for Bertone, was looking for a solution to how far you could go in developing a car with a very low coefficient of drag and still make it something practical to use on the road. They were powered by Alfa Romeo 1900 four-cylinder engines, and first one revealed in 1953, the last in 1955, the BAT 5, 7, and 9. And what they achieved in that time was remarkable. Aerodynamic drag figures not equaled until the late 1960s, early 1970s. And that design philosophy was taken over for the development of this car. This car came about because Alfa Romeo had developed a very successful racing version of the Giulietta Coupe, a lightweight Sprint, a Leggerita. And a few were crashed and rebodied by Carrozzeria Zagato, and they went faster than the factory racers. And Alfa Romeo thought, what can we do to get some of that back into a factory racer? So they looked to Bertone, who asked Scaglione to develop a very slippery, lightweight version of the Giulietta Sprint for them to build. Scaglione came up with a very slippery shape indeed, but the challenge was it was not built in alloy, but rather in steel. So it turned out to be rather heavier than planned, and so the Sprint Speciale was not very successful as a race car. But as a dramatic style statement for a GT, I'd like to say in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was little that could match it. And I think that's really what drew Nick Begovich to this car. It's also interesting that most of the cars in the collection were either acquired new by Nick Begovich or shortly after they were built. This one is very different. This is a car that was acquired by a friend of Dr. Begovich's, who for a long time stored the car in Dr. Begovich's garage. After a certain time, he thought, well, this is ridiculous. Either he should get his car out of here or I should buy it. And they came to terms, and Dr. Begovich bought the car in 1992. Now, what's interesting about that is the fact that, as you will have learned from the other videos in the series about the cars, and also the terrific video that celebrated the opening of the exhibition that we had on his cars, Engineering plus Design equals Passion, you will see that he didn't really drive his special cars very much, if at all, after about 1987 or so. So this is not a car that he actually drove very much, if at all. The other thing that this car has is a non-original engine. The Giulietta was originally powered by a 1300cc version of the famed Alfa double overhead cam inline 4. This one has a later 1750 engine in it, and the later Giulia version of the Sprint Speciale had a 1600 engine. And it's something that was fairly common at the time, back in the 1970s, certainly into the 1980s, where because the engines basically have the same dimension and look the same, more or less, engine swaps were made if you either had a problem with your engine or if you simply wanted to have more power or a different characteristic of power. The 1300cc version of the Giulietta, in my opinion, is a really terrific car, and it has a very, very specific and characteristic power delivery, typical of Italian small bore designs. They have a different character below, say, 4,000, 4,500, 45 to 5,000 RPM. And they like to be held in a high rev range to deliver maximum power whenever they can. The 1750 version has a bit more low-end torque. It loses a bit on the high end from the 1300, but it's still a fairly sporty feeling engine. But ultimately, where the market in Alfa Romeo was going with the engine would be seen in the 2-liter version, the 2000, which is much more oriented towards torque and less towards reviness. And so a lot of people think the 1750 is sort of the sweet spot between them. One of the challenges, however, in doing an engine swap, as we can see in this car, is that the 1750 engine has a very particular oil breather outlet which doesn't have space for the air box for the carburetors that they normally have. So it's sort of adapted on this car. Nonetheless, but you do get a very particular Alfa Romeo twin can driving experience, not the least of which comes from the particular combination of this engine and gearbox. And the feeling that an Alfa Romeo always gives of both sportiness and a certain substantial nature. In all of its forms, the Giulietta also had a profound effect on the Italian automobile industry through Alfa Romeo, because the Giulietta was the first real production car for the masses that Alfa Romeo had ever made. The 1900 was the first step, but before the 1900, Alfa Romeo was really about building a small number of very expensive sports cars for a very select group. The 1900 brought them into the upper middle class market. The Giulietta brought them into the middle class market and mass production. And it's certainly true that it was the Giulietta and the manufacture of the Giulietta Sprint, and to a lesser extent this Sprint Speciale, that also made Bertone a volume manufacturer. I have to say that I also have a very special feeling for these cars because the Bat cars are among my dreams. And they only built one of each of the Bat cars. The set of 3 recently sold for tens of millions of dollars. And although I'd like to think that one day I'll get a chance to drive one of them, it's probably not likely. But the spirit of this car, and my good friend Corrado Lopresto in Milan, Italy, owns the prototype of the Sprint Speciale, which I had the honor and pleasure of keeping in my garage for almost a year and showing it on behalf of Corrado at a number of events, and also doing a little bit of driving. And that prototype is also a very different car than this, much more extreme in its solutions, much closer to the original Bat cars than could be dared for production at the price that Alfa needed to sell these cars. But even in its toned down production version, the Sprint Speciale offers so much exoticism with a very practical Alfa twin cam Giulietta platform. Some of the things that make this car so special in terms of the form is the way this body is constantly curving. There is not one flat piece or form on this bodywork. It always moves in all directions, and it's just a treat to the eye. And I might add, a nightmare for the restorer. This car, although it has received a frankly very casual and rather indifferent repaint in its life, has never been a part for restoration. And you can tell in the way all of the door panels, the hood, the trunk fit, because it's extremely difficult to get all of these compound curves to match up once you've taken the car apart. Even the windshield, the way it flows across and up and down, and the rear window is just an absolute work of art. You can actually see the work of the wind tunnel when you look at the car standing still. And being in it for such a low car, and the seats, the floor is very flat, the seats are low to the floor, so it's a very unusual driving position. It's not for everyone, but if you can become comfortable in the car, it really is incredibly rewarding. And above all else, it's an Alfa with a terrific engine, a great gearbox, wonderful handling, and of course I love this period as well. This beautiful thin-rimmed Nardi wood wheel. It's a very special experience indeed. Once again, I have to say thank you, Nick Begovich, for keeping these cars and passing them along to us to share with millions of people. I'm so grateful.